Presenting, I happen to be one of 47.8% social, emotional, and data reasoning in middle school students' comics about friendship. So this study is part of a larger project called the Data Literacy Through Art Project, which brings together university researchers and cross-subject middle school teachers to co-design curriculum and resources around art and data literacy. And really what our goal was to engage seventh graders in creating comics that reflected on their own friendship perspectives and behaviors through data collection, analysis, and storytelling. As seen here, we have really two research questions, one focused on data reasoning and through the act of creating data comics, and the second looking at social emotional reasoning through the act of creating data comics. So here's an overview of the unit. We engaged 33 seventh graders with the process of analyzing data like graph reading, statistical reasoning while creating data comics. So one math teacher, one art teacher in the same school taught the unit during the spring 2021 semester. So to provide students with this personally relevant data about friendships, we created a 17-item survey that focused primarily on things like beliefs of friendships, describing their own friendships, and certain friendships experiences like bullying, and then provided it to all the seventh grade classes and connected about 92 responses, and then generated charts that the students analyzed, like this one that was responses like 47.8% of seventh graders say they find it kind of easy to make friends. This is another one using some of the questions from Pew were also included in the item survey, so we were enabling students to make comparisons. The students also provided an artist statement, and this was a rubric that evaluated the different kinds of elements that were in their comics and artist statements. And the tool we used is called Pixton, which was great because it really allowed for rapid construction of comics using a library of predefined content that the user could manipulate and build visual and textual narratives. The data that we used was really three sources: the data comics themselves, group interviews that we did with the four students, and individual interviews that we did with the math and art teacher. And then we developed a code book to analyze data reasoning. We also developed a code book to look at social emotional reasoning, which we borrowed the framework from a nonprofit called the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL. So as seen here, students were able to engage in various types of data reasoning with their comics. All 33 comics integrated some form of data reasoning, and only 3 comics really stayed at the level of descriptive, while the rest integrated more advanced forms. As seen here, almost all the comics included some form of social-emotional learning code, with self-awareness being the most prominent at 90%, and the rest being around two-thirds for social awareness and relationship skills. We also looked at co-occurring codes. So for instance, contextualizing data was often also coded with social awareness. What we found was that the kinds of data reasoning students engage in through their creation of these data comics are the kinds that really humanize the personal narratives behind the numbers. So like narratives that are constructed from processes such as like situating oneself into data, considering the context in which the data lives, reflecting on the implications that the data may have. The construction of the data comics really enabled learners to explore their own narratives and social emotional lives that the data represent, and really hypothesize about other narratives implicit in the data. This is in line with like research on verbal interpretive conception of statistical reasoning. The narrative really paved the way for students to engage in reasoning about other factors or measures that might explain the observed pattern. So let's take a look at some examples. In contextualizing the data, what we often saw was students illustrating the kinds of friendships and interactions that the data might represent. So for instance, in this comic, the student uses the data on student responses to the question, do you find it easy to make friends? And uses their narrative to consider reasons that influence those student responses. So they have this whole narrative around making friends at a young age, which really engages in this broad inquiry of the importance of the variable when and how you met your friends as it relates to how easy it is or how hard it is to find or make friends. So in the interview, the student really described their reasoning process, and the student engaged in like perspective taking as they try to examine why students might reply a certain way, what they may have felt as it relates to the survey response. And in other instances of contextualization and social awareness, we saw students really consider lots of different things, like the role of race and other aspects of identity in their relationship to making friendships, and reasoning about the statistical interpretations within the data. We also saw this other type of data reasoning, what we're calling situating self in data. In these interviews we did with students and teachers, we saw that many students really reflected on their own situativity And this builds on work of exploring the advantages of first-person actor perspective taking in data reasoning, where the learners imagine themselves inside of data sets or situate themselves in longitudinal data. So in this comic, for instance, the character really reflects on their own perspectives of the difficulties making friends because it's scary and nerve-wracking, which makes them part of the 47.8% that finds it kind of easy, but also kind of hard to make friends. So, the 24 comics that were coded with this code were also coded with the SEL competency of self-awareness. And in their narratives, it really became clear how these supported one another. The narratives often integrated a character that was being like super reflective on the data and where they fell in it. Going beyond the data was really just was focused more on how the data may be implicated in the future of the characters and their behaviors or actions around building and maintaining friendships. So similar to what has been referred to as reading beyond the data, here students made inferences from the data, like pandemics might increase online friendships, and they like tapped their existing schema for information. So, for instance, online friendships are a lot different than normal friendships. That's really just not explicitly stated in the data. So, for instance, in this data comic, we see students reasoning about the implications of data as a means for self-management. So in the narrative, the author creates this camaraderie between three friends, two of which are empathizing with one character's experience of getting bullied. So in panel 5 and 6, one of the characters finds out a statistic that they use as a means for helping the other character rethink their emotional reaction to bullying. So they connect the high frequency of drama to the need to decrease their emotional reactivity to being bullied, which is example, no big deal. So the character who is bullied ends the comic with this changed perspective. So really using the data to self-manage their feelings around being bullied. And this connection between the use of data to reflect on how one might manage their emotions was not just enacted through the comic narratives, but in the way that the authors like really reflected on their reasoning process. Here's another example in this data comic. The student not only engages in reasoning about the implications of the data, but extends those implications to making decisions about their social media use. They identify that 15.2% of the class does not use social media and then go on to pose a set of questions related to the effects of social media, why people might not use it, whether there are benefits to using it. And through the narrative, the author demonstrates this evolution through time and how the main character spends their time. So this comic form just really provides the opportunity to elaborate on what's not there. And we see this as a potential jumping off point to use these comic artifacts not just as the final conclusions drawn from data, but as this tool with this sense-making process. So while the process of constructing a narrative really supported different kinds of data reasoning, the content focused on data about teen friendships meant that the reasoning about the data also enacted all of these like social emotional reasoning competencies, such as self-awareness, social awareness, and relationship skills, right? Um, so, uh, as we start to talk more about this humanistic interdisciplinary view of data literacy, this form of expressive constructive art making can really fuse this personally and culturally relevant discipline to data literacy and really invite learners to bring their own interests and experiences and skills to meaning making. And integrating this art-based approach that really centers data on relationships themselves can create these opportunities for data reasoning to be more connected to things like social emotional learning. So we hope this can be like further explored in future work. Much for your time. If you have any questions or are looking to collaborate, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.